right now. And I wish you a nice webinar. And so, Stephen, you can take it away.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. Well, a very, very good afternoon, good morning to you all. It's a great pleasure to be with you today and spend the next 3 hours with you. So, as Jean-Paul mentioned, I have the responsibility for teaching Module 3, and this is all about evaluating international possibilities. So I'll try to put this in the context of this double loop that Jean-Paul has illustrated here and position it in the sense of what we need to do in terms of our internationalization process as a whole. But we're looking specifically today at market selection. So how do we select markets, and also touching upon entry mode strategies. And those two are very, very related, of course, because as soon as you're going into a new market, you have to make the decision as to what entry mode strategy you're going to use. And the entry mode strategy should hopefully, ideally, be aligned with the characteristics of the market that you're going into. So we'll talk a lot more about that over the next few hours. And if you've had the opportunity of having a look at the slides, which were uploaded earlier, you'll see that I've also got a case that you can be working on to try to put some of these ideas into practice. So that's the thought. As I always teach, I'm very, very open. So we can just talk about whatever you want to talk about related to this. So if you have any questions at all, if you feel that what I've said didn't quite work in your particular context, then please feel free just to mention that so that we can start a discussion. Because operating in international markets is hugely sector-specific, country-specific, culture-specific, and so on. So strategies that might work in one country might fail miserably in another country. So it's very nice to hear if you have a different experience of these issues so that we can begin to look at what we call boundary conditions. To what extent can strategies extend to certain areas, and are there limitations to what we can use them for? So if you have any questions at all, I know some of you are more versed in international business than others, but if you have any questions, please feel free just to stop me and ask, and we'll take it from there. So it's a flexible program. I'm driven by your needs. So if you have the need to discuss a particular issue or go off slightly, then that's perfectly fine with me. So welcome to you all, and a little bit of background about myself. I've tried to include a slide here. So I'm an economist by training, and I have a PhD from the University of Southern Denmark, and I have about 20 years of experience in private banking, mainly in Latin America, the Caribbean area, and consulting, which is primarily in the Middle East, Africa, where most of my consulting projects were. And I've also started businesses in different countries with varying degrees of success. And in terms of academia, I'm a completely freelance. I used to be tenured. I used to be a faculty member, but now I'm completely freelance. So I teach at 5 schools around the world at the moment. And the main one is Hult International Business School, which is a Triple Crown school. And I've been there since 2014, a professor of economics there. So I teach 8 or 9 courses there a year. MBAs, EMBAs, DBAs, and so on. I'm at the Gordon Institute of Business Science, which has just been acclaimed in the top 50 business schools in the world, and the top one in Africa consistently. So I teach global business strategy there for the MBA students. And I'm at the AUB, which is a lovely university. in Beirut. So I teach in Lebanon a couple of courses a year, and also at the Mediterranean School of Business in Tunis. So Bilal, I'm back in Tunis in a few days' time. Be there for the whole of next week. And I'm in Tunisia for about 6 or 7 trips a year. And I've already had 24 flights this year. So I'm on the move, teaching in different places all over the world. And I'm also academic director and professor at the Luxembourg School of Business, academic director for the MBA program. And I teach corporate strategy, business strategy, and entrepreneurship to the MBA students in Luxembourg. So in addition to this, of course, I'm a researcher, and our findings have been published in places like The Economist, Forbes last year. We presented to the United Nations last year, also to their International Labour Organization all around the world. And we work quite closely with corporates as well in terms of helping use our research findings to inform the strategy that firms should be doing in international markets. And most of the research is on international markets. So how do firms set up subsidiaries? How do they work with indirect exports and such like? And I met Jean-Paul actually because one of our articles was published, and it was actually the think tank La Fabrique de l'Exportation in Paris that picked up on this article and invited me to come to Paris and deliver a talk about it. It was all about how you use piggybacking to go into foreign markets. I can talk a little bit more about that if you're interested, but it's simply the idea that you don't commit any resources yourself, but you actually ride on the back of another company, of an established company, into foreign markets. And if you think of, for example, Intel Inside, that's a classic piggybacking strategy. So Intel don't have any costs in terms of setting up distribution channels or anything like this. They basically sell business to business, and it's their business partner, HP or whoever it is, that actually has all the distribution costs associated with that, relationships with retailers and so on. And so I met Jean-Paul there, and I gave another presentation about how do you target the base of the pyramid. So this is typically in Africa, parts of Asia, also parts of Latin America, where people are at the absolute base of the income pyramid, earning less than $2 a day. How do you actually develop strategies for reaching people who have got very, very little money whatsoever? And this in itself may seem to be a hopeless task, but actually the vast majority of multinationals around the world today are looking at the base of the pyramid and thinking, well, there are actually huge opportunities here. There's huge potential here. We have to change our business models a little bit. We have to change the approach to tackling this particular segment. But it's a very, very viable segment. So if you actually aggregate the people at the base of the pyramid, it would be, and those earning less than $2 a day, it would be the third largest economy on the planet. So there are lots of advantages, but we have to make our business models affordable. We have to make them accessible and so on. We have to be very, very creative. So I give a lot of presentations about this to corporates and to business schools around the world. And on the back of that, I was invited to join Jean-Paul and become a certified expert and be part of his scientific committee and actually help Institut MX and Mercadex going forward in the future. So that's how we got to know each other, and that's why I'm here today. So that's a little bit about me. I was wondering if we could quickly just go through you as participants, and you can tell us a little bit about yourselves. That gives me a little bit of background. I know a little bit about you, but a little bit more background would be really interesting. Ladies first, let's start with Raluca. I've also taught many, many times in Bucharest, so
Okay.
I love Romanian students. So I'm
Okay.
always delighted to have Romanian students in the class.
Okay, so thank you for this presentation. It's true that talking a little bit about our backgrounds allows us to better know each other. As for me, I'm a professor of international marketing. I am based in Université du Littoral Côte d'Opale in Dunkirk, and my research areas are import-export relationship management. And also, I mean, a while ago, I was working on how companies gather information about foreign markets and what do they do with it in order to take decisions regarding, I don't know, new product development, entering new markets, and all those kind of decisions companies, small and mid-sized firms actually take in order to manage their international activities. So this would be the essential about myself.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you very much. Are you specialized in certain sectors or certain regions, or are you global?
I'm working, actually, I always worked on small and mid-sized firms, on manufacturing companies. And since 2 years, I'm part of the executive committee of, it's called IFSI. It's a transdisciplinary school in sea related sciences. So basically, since we are in Dunkirk and we have a campus in Boulogne-sur-Mer, this is the first seafood harbor in France. And all those industries are very oriented in terms of imports and exports. And therefore, more recently, I've been working on seafood transformation industries, importers and exporters' behaviors. And before, I was working on manufacturing companies, and my thesis was on textile and steel industries in France.
Very interesting. Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Adnan, you are the next one on my screen. A very warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much, sir. A little background of me is that I'm from a small island called Reunion Islands. It's a French department on the Indian Oceans. I've lived there for my childhood. Then I went for Paris for study, and I work in the banking system, first in BPCE. Then I wanted to go on something more tech. I went to United. It was United Credit there, and I've worked with Algolia. So it was a French, and it's became American standards. And I've learned about e-commerce. That's where I get my teeth. And I've learned a bit more about e-commerce, digital SEO, and cross-borders international export goods through a marketplace and platform. And then I've started a company, a data company in Mauritius, that we are now located in DIFC in Dubai. And I'm looking now a bit more about knowing really more skills on international levels for me.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, thank you very much indeed. And Bilal, welcome.
Thank you. Bilal Ben Hamida, and I'm the Executive Director of Connect International. It's the structure dedicated for international affairs for the employers organization in Tunisia. It's Connect. And we work to assist the Tunisian company or the foreign company in Tunisia to go for international market. And it's very interesting for us to be in this training for globalization of companies in general. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So where are your companies venturing to primarily? Are they internationally primarily to the MENA region? Are they internationalizing to France, Belgium, or more global? What kind of patterns do you see?
Yes, our first partner is the Europe region. But in 10 last years, many companies that are oriented for African markets And we work also for the new market like Asian, like America, and the traditional also the MENA region and the Gulf country. We are working worldwide now.
Yeah, very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, thank you very much. Bernard?
All right. Yes. I thought it was very interesting to listen to your presentation, because it gives it's a little bit the purpose why I enter into this this session is to meet interesting people, and also learn all this aspect of the business that I don't need to worry too much about, because I'm there to structure. When they have a strategy, they tell me they want an agent, they want to be Intel inside, they want to have a distributor, they want to license. So then I materialize, but I try to understand also the business aspect, because I mainly serve companies that don't have an internal lawyer. So I'm more strategic and get to know the CEO, the CFO, and all these people. And so that's one part. I've already explained the type of work that I do. And I also teach. I teach where I'm asked as a, not a professor, but chargé de cours, they call. And it's business school, law school, master degree, various topics, intellectual property, international business, law. And I use, I always talk about the global. I have a PhD on the OECD. How do companies, no, how do 24 countries at that time do to develop rules that become global? And I wrote books on international free trade agreements and global agreements. But now I'm here as a student, so I will stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Bernard. It's very interesting. So you say you're working primarily with companies that don't have in-house lawyers. So I would imagine small, medium enterprises, startups as well, possibly.
Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. And I think this is a fascinating debate, this space that we're in at the moment about the rules-based order. And is this something which is becoming stronger, or is it gradually being dismantled by various political, economic social events that are going on around the world?
Yeah.
And this, of course, has a massive impact, doesn't it, for international business? Because if we can't defend our property rights, then what can we do?
No, the property right, that's fine. You're in a system where there's a rule of law or there's no rule of law. But what's more problematic with regard to regulations is that state consider companies like being the weapons. So they say, okay, you can't sell this technology now to this other country. Now you have sanctions against this person. So, and they have sometimes very ambiguous rules with regard to sanction that you develop, let's say Russia, you develop China, you develop all sorts of countries. And then from, you don't see it from the blues. Something happens. So the government say, hey, we need to do something about this. Same thing for forced labor. Same thing for money laundering. So there are lots of chaos. So companies now have enormous team of compliance, and that's a big business right now. So they are mainly affected by all these rules where the state considered the companies as their tools to impose sanctions.
Yeah, and we see this very directly in the case of ASML, for example, which is the world's leading supplier of machines to make microchips or semiconductors. And it almost has a monopoly, effective monopoly on the supply of these machines. They're like the size of a house. So it's not something that people can replicate very quickly, but they sell to all of these companies around the world that are producing semiconductors, primarily in Taiwan, for example. And of course, you know, they're under immense pressure from the US government, because the US government is in a way having a proxy war with China over the production of semiconductors, which we use in everything. We use them in smartphones and electric vehicles and
weapons.
everything now. Yeah, precisely. So the American government's actually pressing the Dutch government, ASML is a Dutch company, not to actually supply China. And what does it do in the event that China does actually invade Taiwan, if in that eventuality? So this is very, very interesting that we have, you know, countries which don't actually have any authorization pressuring other countries, third-party countries, not to supply people who are potential strategic rivals. So this is rather interesting. This is the world that we're living in now, and I think that there's a lot of focus away from more market strategies. Raluca, you were talking about international marketing and the classic marketing strategies that we talk about. In many ways, there's a movement now towards what we call non-market strategies, where firms are using governments, firms are using legislation. So can we prevent TikTok from operating in the US if it has, you know, unless it has a non-Chinese owner? So a lot of competitors are using, you talked about governments using firms as weapons. I see more and more firms using governments as weapons.
Exactly.
To actually change the playing field in their advantage. And this is rather interesting. You need great lobby skills, you need great knowledge of regulations and compliance and so on. But if you could, in a way, kill off your competitors, then you don't need to think, you know, how do we position, what kind of segments are we in, what pricing policy should we use? You can suddenly erase your competitors. And this is rather interesting.
And sad.
So
And
they're
it's,
very, very, yeah, sorry?
so I'll stop after, and it's tied with the rules on election system, whereby if you can pour in lots of money in order to have your candidate elected, then you've got more influence, and then you you take the call and you say, okay, I want this to be eliminated, and the guy will tell you yes. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, so we have a direct correlation between the political and the economic aspects in all aspects of business. And I think that as we move more and more afield, as we move more into global economies, global value chains, as we move more and more into emerging and frontier markets, these regulations and rules of the game are less transparent than they are if we were just operating in North America or Western Europe. So we have to try to navigate this immense uncertainty, unpredictability, and all the risks that are associated with that. And not just operational risks, but compliance risks that you mentioned, reputational risks, market risks, currency risks, because currencies are not just determined by market forces. They're often regulated by governments, as we know. Raluca.
I think our friend has a question, yeah.
Yes, Raluca.
Yes, it's not a question about the class. It's just that my colleague Falk Wagenhausen is in the waiting room, and I don't know whether you or Jean-Paul can accept him.
I haven't seen him actually.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to ask Jean-Paul, because I'm co-host, but I haven't had the message that he has arrived yet. So, or is in the waiting room. So thank you for alerting me to that. Just excuse me 1 second. Okay, let's see if that works. So you will have seen the MX decision flow here in terms of international business strategy. And this is a very kind of holistic perspective. As we know, many firms are reactive in terms of internationalization. So they're pressured by small markets, saturated domestic markets, small niches, or whatever, that actually forces them in a way or compels them to have more of an international presence. It could be regulatory factors. It could be that they've received orders from abroad without them actually having marketed their products in that particular country. But of course, as we're more and more digital these days, we can often get reactive orders that we weren't even aware of. So, yes, Falk, you're with us.
Yes, hello, and sorry for the delay.
Yeah, okay, no problem at all. It's nice to have you with us. We're just beginning to talk a little bit about the decision flow here. And one thing we have just done is just had a quick round of introductions. So would you just like to say a few words about yourself?
Okay, me, I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Economics and Management Department of our university. And normally I'm more specialized in supply chain management than in international commerce.
Great. Well, it's lovely to have you with us. So are you a teaching dean or are you a non-teaching dean?
I'm also teaching dean.
Yeah.
When I have the chance to teach because there's lots of administration, actually.
Yeah. Great. Well, lovely to have you with us.
Thanks a lot.
So we have to start off in the in numerically position 1 in terms of the international qualification. So how qualified are we to actually internationalize? And this is something I think, Raluca, you will know a lot about. This, of course, could be the resources that you have at your disposal. Are these resources going to allow you or facilitate internationalization? So have you got the right kind of people with that kind of mindset, with the skills that can allow you to internationalize? What kind of resources do you have? Financial, organizational, both tangible and intangible resources. And of course, what kind of risk propensity do you have? What kind of control do you need to exert when operating? There are some firms that want to maintain a very high level of control. There are some firms which have very high levels of risk aversity. So they tend to remain in less risky markets or engage in less risky operations. So we need to be able in a way to document what kind of resources we have within that firm. And of course, some of those resources are internal, but resources can also be external. So have you got access to network partners? Have you got access to alliances and forms of strategic partnerships? And then that leads very nicely on to the 2 areas that we're going to be talking about today. And that's the focus of the next 2.5 hours, is on points 2 and 3. So when we're going into new markets, we can be reactive, of course, but we can also be active. So we can actively try to systematically assess what kind of markets are going to be the best for us to enter. And on that basis, use a kind of a funnel approach to delimit the countries to a certain extent so that we prioritize one particular country to go into. Now, that in itself is also a huge strategic decision. Should we go into multiple countries simultaneously? Have we got the resources to do that? We're more likely to do that if we have a platform strategy, for example, that allows us to be very flexible. We can rapidly change direction. if we are more resource heavy, if we're involved in manufacturing and such like, then it's a lot harder to enter multiple markets, because it requires a much greater level of resources, and that might not be viable for the particular company. So we need to think about, how do we use our resources most efficiently? And we know that there's a return associated with going into international markets. So most of our countries are relatively small in terms of the demand in that particular market. So I know, for example, Tunisia, 12 million people, Denmark, 5.8 million people. So the internal market quickly gets saturated. So we need to think, which markets do we want to go into, and how does that associate with our need for control, our need for mitigating risks, and so on and so forth. So these are factors that are driving us to go into international markets. But there's also, of course, a risk associated with that. So many economists talk about a risk-adjusted rate of return. We typically talk about this in terms of financial securities, financial instruments, that there's a certain return on it, but typically there's also a risk on it as well. Unless you're talking about a government bond from Western Europe, for example, that's pretty risk-free. But otherwise, financial instruments have some form of risk. So we have to think, using our knowledge, using our expertise, is there a way that we can improve this risk-adjusted rate of return? And we can do this by having the same level of return, just at a lower level of risk, or we can do it at having the same level of risk, but having a higher level of return. So this is essentially what we're trying to do here. We're trying to eliminate markets that are excessively risky, or where the returns are not particularly viable. I also work with many companies that have found they have internationalized and it's gone wrong. So now they have to retreat from a market in some way. And as we know, there are significant exit barriers associated with many industries in many countries. So this makes it quite hard to extricate yourself from one particular market without suffering quite high losses, financial losses. So it's important to try to be a little bit more systematic going into our choice of markets, rather than going into a market in a more or in a less systematic way, and then suddenly realizing that that's the wrong market to go into. A lot of the markets we go into are not particularly systematic. So we find that firms go into markets because they have some form of relation there, or they visited that country, or they met someone at a trade fair, and so on and so forth. So the research that's gone into it, the data that's needed to verify whether this is going to be an attractive market or not, was never actually undertaken. So this is something that we're trying to do here, to be a little bit more systematic and ensure that we can enjoy the returns without being exposed to excessive amounts of losses. So this is essentially what we're doing. How do we generate relevant internationalization options? And we have a choice of lots of different markets. So even if we wanted to restrict ourselves to a regional market, we still have a host of countries that we can go into. And every single country is very, very different from one another. There's a high degree of heterogeneity. So even though we might think that the 3 Scandinavian countries are pretty similar in terms of cultures, in terms of demand drivers, we're actually very, very different from one another. And it's these nuances, these subtleties, if you like, that mean that it's very, very difficult. And firms succeeding in Sweden might fail in Norway. So we have to also think, when we're looking at a much broader range of countries where this heterogeneity is going to be even bigger. So if we're talking about going into China or India or South Africa or wherever, then these differences between countries become greater and greater. And then lots of differences in terms of country-specific factors. So culture, of course, demand drivers differ from one country to the next. Market conditions differ. What's the market structure like? Are we in an oligopolistic market? Are we in a more duopolistic market? And so on. We're looking at the availability of partners. So is it a mature market that has a lot of partners who we could form some form of alliance with? Or are we going into new territory where economies have not yet matured in terms of that? Are we dealing with markets that were formerly state socialist or still largely state socialist, so that we're dealing with competitors who are typically state-owned enterprises that are basically financed by the state and can take enormous risks? Are we dealing with emerging markets that have a very high level of informal economy, sometimes up to 70, 75% in certain countries of Africa and Latin America especially? So who are we actually up against? Is it easy to obtain data from some of these countries? It's not at all. It's a very opaque or non-transparent process in many cases. So we have to try to find ways of eliminating countries using variables, typically demand drivers. And then, of course, we have to prioritize how we're going to do that. Are we going to prioritize one particular country? Are we going to have a more incremental approach to internationalization? What is often referred to as the Uppsala model from Sweden, where companies go gradually into neighboring countries, and then gradually, like rings in the water, as they describe it, move out to adjacent markets, and then gradually markets further and further away from one another. So if that is the case, then it's a very incremental process. It's a slow process. You're learning a lot from one market before you move into another market. And of course, this might be very problematic if your product needs you to be on the market very, very quickly. Let's say it's a startup with a great idea that could be scaled up rapidly. If you move incrementally, then you often lose that particular advantage. So we have to find ways of eliminating in an efficient way, and then thinking, where should our priorities be? And should we move into lower risk markets and receive lower returns? Should we move into higher risk markets if we're seeking higher returns? Should we move into multiple markets simultaneously? Should it be more incremental? Should we try and find what we call springboard countries? So in other words, you go into, for example, Tunisia as a way of entering North Africa or the MENA region. Should you go into the biggest markets? Should you do what we call cherry picking and going into smaller markets that have bigger neighbors, but where these markets are have a much higher level of governance? So in other words, lower levels of corruption, lower levels of bureaucracy, easier to do business, better hard and soft infrastructure, and so on. So there's a lot of factors that need to be taken into consideration here. And this is what we try to do with the TRIACS model here, is that we try to make it a little bit more systematic. So what we're looking at here is what we call marketing product mixes. So in other words, in any one particular market, you could have several products that you're introducing. And each and every product could actually be marketed in multiple countries. So you have this matrix here, where on the y-axis you've got products, and on the x-axis you've got countries. And this is an actual case that Mercadets have worked with, but it's been anonymized, obviously, for the purposes of teaching. But this is a case that makes a company that makes overwhelmingly medical equipment, and not entirely, but overwhelmingly. And as you can see here, they sell to both the private sector and the public sector. So you can imagine state hospitals or private hospitals, for example. And this is also something we find that when we're taking any one particular company, they can be selling sometimes B2C, so selling to consumers in certain countries. They can be selling to businesses in other countries. And in third countries, they could be selling to governments, or B2G, as we call it. So we also have to think about that these segments can actually be nuanced even more. So here, what we've done for the purposes of illustration is just to say we've got both a private sector and a public sector in each of the 4 countries. And then each of these countries just has a number. So each of the product market mix has a number. And those numbers are not ranked in any particular way. They're just seen as a number. And we have to think, first of all, are there any necessary conditions that these countries need to have? So in other words, what is it that's a necessary but not sufficient condition, but a necessary condition? Something that would enable our particular company to be successful in that market, such that if that was absent in some way, then we might as well just stay out of that market immediately. So these necessary conditions are also what we call boundary conditions or delimiting conditions. So it could be trading bloc membership. So we're seeing more and more countries wanting to join the WTO, the World Trading Organization, but not everyone is a member. Many of the large countries in the world, for example, China, they joined first in 2001. Russia joined first in 2010. So many of these large economies have been quite slow in joining the World Trade Organization, which is designed to reduce tariff and non-tariff barriers around the world and create more free trade and the gains from free trade. So trading bloc membership could be a crucial thing if you're dealing with a country which has not yet attained WTO status. This makes it very, very difficult to trade with these countries. So it could be, I've done some consulting in Sudan, for example, for companies in the Gulf. Sudan is a very, very attractive market for many reasons. It's the breadbasket of North Africa, the Horn of Africa, and indeed most of Africa. So it has very, very fertile land. It has a lot of land which has not been cultivated yet, so has enormous potential. But getting access to this is really difficult. And if you want to produce produce and export that, then you might not be able to do that given the tariffs that are being imposed on that country as a non-WTO member. So this is something we're seeing. We're seeing the rise of trading blocs, particularly on a regional basis, but also many countries which are outside of those trading blocs. So that might be a condition that you say, if you're not a member, then we're not interested in internationalizing to your particular market. It could be the availability of hard and soft infrastructure. So hard infrastructure, let's say you're importing tractors into the Horn of Africa, you need hard infrastructure, you need port access, you need roads and railways, airlines, and so on. And of course, soft infrastructure, do we have the ICT in position? Are we off the grid? What kind of connectivity do we have? This is, of course, enormously important in terms of operations. Have we got distribution partners? In certain countries, markets are not particularly mature, especially for many types of products. So there may simply be a lack of partners. And if your business model is based on strategic partnerships where you're allying with agents or distributors or retailers, then an absence of these would be sufficient to stay away from a particular market. We also, of course, have IPR protection. Again, if we go into countries where this is threatened, then we can risk that we lose our core competencies, we lose our sustainable competitive advantage, for example. So this in itself is very problematic. And of course, you know, many countries also delimit, many firms also delimit countries on the basis of unacceptable levels of corruption. And there's quite a lot of data which is secondary data, which can inform us. Also, in terms of availability of distribution partners and what type of infrastructure they have. So we're typically using secondary data to ascertain whether companies satisfy these necessary conditions or not. Yes, Falk.
Sorry.
Yes,
Is
don't
it
apologize. Before you joined, I said just ask as many questions as you like. So,
so is it possible to tell me a little bit more about the point of the hard and the soft infrastructure?
Yeah. So the hard infrastructure is actually transportation. So have we got the infrastructure to transport products around the country? So this is railways, this is road systems, airports, and also ports. So I can give you an example. I can give you the example of Ethiopia. So Ethiopia is the second largest country in Africa in terms of population. It's a massive country. It wants to be the China of Africa in terms of being the biggest manufacturer of products that can be sold on in global markets. It also has quite a reform-minded government, so that have embarked on quite ambitious reform programs. And a lot of that has been attracting capital to build the infrastructure, because you can't have the ambition of being a manufacturing giant, as Ethiopia has, but not have the transportation to be able to move products in and out of the country. The big problem that Ethiopia faces is it has this ambition, but it's a landlocked country. It doesn't actually have a port. So this is really problematic for Ethiopia, because the port that it uses is the tiny, tiny country of Djibouti, which has less than 1 million people. And it's a bottleneck. Everybody getting products into the Horn of Africa comes through this little port of Djibouti, and it's run by DP World. So it's run very efficiently. But if you imagine the volume of imports and exports coming into that country, it makes it very, very difficult. So what Ethiopia is doing now, rather interestingly, is it's trying to become best friends with its neighbor, Eritrea, who it's had conflicts with for many, many years, so that it could begin to use one of the ports there. It's borrowed a lot of money from China to actually build a railway to go from Addis, the capital, all the way down to Lamu on the Indian Ocean in Kenya. And it's also done a very, very interesting strategy just a few months ago, which is actually leasing part of Somaliland. So neighboring Somalia is obviously a sovereign country, but there are certain autonomous regions that have broken away from Somalia. And one of them is Somaliland. So they're claiming that they're an independent country, and they have their own governments, they have their own policies, and so on. It's a fascinating area. But, you know, for Ethiopia to actually lease part of Somaliland, the coast, to build a port to bring its products into Ethiopia is quite radical, because, of course, the majority of the world sees Somalia as the sovereign nation and not Somaliland. So there are all kinds of political conflicts in this particular area. And this is all to do with Ethiopia's need to have this infrastructure in place, because you can't import products and you can't export your finished products. So, you know, unless you have a self-sufficient economy, you need this infrastructure to work. So also they're in the process of privatizing Ethiopian Airlines, and they want to make Addis Ababa the biggest hub for air traffic. So actually to take over the role of the Gulf, for example, in doing transcontinental flights. They want everything now to go through Addis Ababa. And so they have a lot of ambitions. There's also, of course, lots of problems, as you know, with Tigray and the claims of genocide in the Tigray province, and which has also slowed down their ambitions dramatically. But this would be an example of the hard infrastructure. If it's simply non-existent or it's not developed enough, then it's very, very difficult for firms to do business.
I think I understand very well. What is your meaning about a soft infrastructure? What is your definition, or what is your meaning about a soft infrastructure? Because
soft infrastructure is the communications. So ICT, for example. So if you're going into a country, you'll need to have communications. You might be setting up a subsidiary there. Are you going to be having, is it connected to the grid, for example? Are you going to have problems that you simply can't get connected? You can't have meetings with people because the power is down all the time. So the soft infrastructure is more the power, the energy, the ICT that fuels both communication, but also operations. So, and this is enormously important. We take it for granted in Europe, you know, but if you go to somewhere like South Africa, the power outages happen all the time. I can be on a call to colleagues in South Africa, and we have to have 3 calls to have a simple conversation, spread over a period of time. So within any one day. And this goes back to, you know, it's a state-owned energy company, Eskom, and it's not particularly efficient and it's very corrupt and so on. But the fact is, it makes it very, very, very difficult to do business in these countries. So both hard and soft infrastructure relate to the ease of doing business. If they're non-existent, it's almost impossible to run a business in those countries. Now, of course, it depends a little bit on your product. So if you have a platform strategy and you're doing online teaching, for example, the hard infrastructure doesn't matter. That's not a constraint. But the soft infrastructure would be a massive constraint if we were unable to have this class, for example. So it's very product specific in that sense.
okay, thanks a lot.
Okay, you're welcome. Any other questions at all? So what we do here is we simply use these necessary conditions to eliminate a lot of product market mix combinations here. So we keep the green ones and we dispense with the red ones. So we can see now we've limited our approach quite a lot. And this is just an example of what we're actually looking at. So the type of products, it's a scanner, a defibrillator, the type of country that we're going into, and what kind of market is it being used for. So is it medical equipment? Is it health and life sciences, and so on? So now we begin to limit the countries and the products. This makes it very, very clear now that we've done a delimitation, an elimination. And now how do we start to prioritize a little bit? So what we're doing is we're looking essentially at what we talked about earlier, which is risk and return. So we're just using slightly different labels here.
Stefan,
yes.
You're taking an example, and we don't understand where the company comes from. So it's a company that wants to market a defibrillator. Is that right?
Correct. Yes. So this is as mentioned, this was actually a real case that Jean-Paul was working on. So the specific company agreed that we could use the information for teaching purposes, but that it couldn't be identified.
No, I don't mind. I just want to understand. So they went to
Yeah.
see Paul and they say, hey, I have a defibrillator. I'd like to conquer the world. Can you go back to the two other slides? Sorry.
Yes.
So then you say, okay, how many defibrillators there are in, and why do you put a green and a red?
Well, what we've done is we've gone to the step here before. So we
Yeah.
automatically delimit a lot of countries and a lot of products in that particular country. So if we look at those, and it could be we have other factors as well, and we simply go in and say, okay, in certain countries for that particular product, it's not going to be accessible, it's not going to be acceptable to go into. So if that is the case, if you don't satisfy the necessary conditions, then that product market
Sorry,
mix
can you be
gets a red number.
Because you understand that it's very vague. Just be precise. So you put a 1 and you put a 2, and why is 1 and a green and why is 2 red?
Okay, as mentioned, the numbers are not values. The numbers, if you like, are just a category. Yeah. So the category of defibrillator in the private sector in country 1, we just label as 1. 1 is not any better than 25 or better than 14. It's just a number. It's just a category. Then what we do is we go back to the necessary conditions here. So this helps us delimit. So if on this basis, we delimit all of those numbers, all of those categories that are now in red. So now they're out of the way. We're not focused on those at all. These have been eliminated from our systematic approach.
Stefan,
Then we're left with the green ones.
Sorry, I have a mental blockage. For me, it's like abstract. I understand it's red and it's green. I want to know why.
Because if we
give specific examples, for instance, there are hospitals, there are no hospitals.
Right. In that sense, yes. Yeah. Well, it could be public sector hospitals have got no money, or there's a high level of corruption in the public system that we typically don't have so much in the private sector. So if that's a necessary condition, low levels of corruption, and you see there's high levels of corruption, and as you will undoubtedly know, corruption is typically defined as being public sector. So public sector officials wanting bribes, for example. So if we just stay with that idea, then it could very well be that in country 1, there's a very, very high level of corruption, and therefore you tend to stay out of all the public sector areas. Scanners may be a slight exception for some reason. Maybe it's less susceptible to corruption than the other products, for example. We know that corruption is related to products. There are certain products like commodities which are much higher correlated with corruption levels than others. So it could be something like this. So this is just an exercise in a way to say, okay, how do we eliminate? So out of this possible 25 combinations, how do we actually start eliminating them? Because we don't want to go into these 25 mixes all at the same time. So we need to eliminate a whole lot of them. And when we use these criteria, then we can automatically eliminate those that are not passing the test. And these are all the ones that we're having in red, for example. So they're stop. All the green ones are go. So now we can be a little bit more specific about what they are. And then, as mentioned, this idea of risk and return, the return, of course, is the potential. So we need to think of what kind of potential are they from a scale of 1 to 10. And then on the next axis, on the x-axis that we'll come to in a second, these are the risks also on a scale of 1 to 10. So this is helping us prioritize. So we need to be able to position these mixes on this 2x2, if you like, where we look at potential or return, and where we look at risk, or the word used is entry ticket here in the Megadex terminology. So here we're looking at factors that are important. Market size. So how do we define market potential, for example? I'll show you that in just a minute. And what's the market trend? So is it a market which is growing? Is it a market which is stable? Is it a market which is growing exponentially? And so on. What kind of segments are available? How are those segments expanding or declining? And then, of course, purchasing power. So we need to think about what are inflation levels in these countries, what kind of rate of interest is there, what are the disposable earnings that people have, what's their ability and their willingness to pay. And we could also look at, for example, competitive advantage. So these are just some factors. There could be other factors that you would rather prioritize instead. But what kind of competitive advantage do you have over your rivals, for example? You might have competitive advantage in one particular sector, but not in others. And then when we're looking at the risks, this is what we call the entry ticket. And the risks, of course, are the costs that are entailed. So how much would it actually cost to get into a new market? And these costs, of course, are physical costs. So we have to pay to set up a subsidiary, for example, or to build a greenfield site, or to make an acquisition. So different entry modes are associated with different levels of costs. Of course, risks that we've touched upon before. And risks can be operational. They can be market risks. So operational risks, simply that we start operating in a country where the supply chain is disrupted, and disrupted quite extensively and regularly. So are we able to get our products to a port, for example? This is a big risk that you would have, for example, in Ethiopia. Market risks. Are we overestimating the market? So we think that there's a market of 50 million, but in actual fact, there's only 5 million people. There can be exchange rate risks. So how is the exchange rate movement vis-a-vis our base currency? There can be reputational risks. Are we likely to be operating in a country where there are reputational issues at stake? Child labor, chemicals used, all of these kind of problems, compliance risks. So there's a case going on just now that I was reading about yesterday, and this is Bayer and their weed killer, which has caused cancer among many of their users. And many have unfortunately died from using Bayer's weed killer. And this has been going through the courts for 20 years in the States. There's an outcome now. And this obviously is huge reputational damage to a company like Bayer. So we have to think in terms of the processes, in terms of the supply chains that we're using, what kind of risks are we likely to face? There could, of course, be cyber risks. That's a very significant risk at the moment. Political risk. Is it likely that governments are going to nationalize or simply expropriate or take over or steal, if you like, our companies? And this is a risk which is very, very top of mind at the moment for many companies which have had a presence in Russia before the invasion. So now the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 22, and now all of a sudden companies that have been present in Russia for many, many decades have got to make the decision, what should they do? Should they pull out? Should they sell their assets very cheaply, and so on? And we've seen companies like Heineken having to sell their factories for a token amount, for €1 actually, to a Russian investor, just to be able to pull out of the Russian market and not have criticism from their stakeholders. So these are very strong risks that you have to face in certain countries. And these risks are present in many countries, Venezuela also, for example, Iran, of course. So lots of countries that have very, very high levels of political risk. And rivalry. To what extent are we meeting rivals in that particular market? We know that in many countries of for example, Western Europe, North America, for example, there's what we call multi-point competition. So the same companies are meeting each other in multiple markets all around the world. And in a way, you know who your rivals are. So BMW, Audi, and Mercedes, for example, they will engage in multi-point competition. So they will be fighting one another in France. They'll be fighting one another in Tunisia. They'll be fighting one another in Romania, and so on and so forth. But when we move to some markets, there's not always multi-point competition. In many cases, many firms choose to stay out of particular markets because of the very high levels of risks or perceived risks. And we often get local competitors, and we often find that the biggest challenges to multinationals are the local firms. And also the conditions of the terrain. So what kind of challenges are there in dealing with countries that are very bureaucratic, where it's difficult to open businesses, close businesses, secure permits, where there may be what we call institutional holes that make it difficult to do business. So then what we're doing here is just simply putting them, if you can imagine, going from 0 to 10 on the y-axis, 0 to 10 on the entry axis, entry ticket, and then we can begin to divide them into these quadrants here. Now, obviously, if the risks are very, very low and the potential is very high, that's the podium. And conversely, if the risks are very high but the potential is very low, that's the gallows. So we can see here that we can go and actually assess what is the risk adjusted rate of return here. And we find some that we may be, if we take the bottom left quadrant, for example, the test bench could be very interesting because here we have an area where the risks are low, the potential is still quite low, but the potential may increase quite dramatically. Whereas with net, the costs are still relatively low, but there's not so much potential. So we may react. And as we mentioned at the very beginning, a lot of exporters, for example, are reactive. They will suddenly get an order from Turkey that means that they then start dispatching products to Turkey, and they may never get another order again, or this order may be repeated, it may be expanded, but you haven't actually made any efforts to go into Turkey. It's a reactive approach. Otherwise, it's the active approach or the proactive approach, where you actually systematically assess which countries you want to go into, and then make an active approach to market these particular countries, develop distribution partners, and so on. So what they've done there is they have just, what Jean-Paul has done is he's taken the green circles that we had. So these 10 green circles back here, this one here, and then simply plotted them on what type of potential compared to what type of entry ticket or risks they're facing. And simply drawn a 90-degree angle here and simply delimited all those that have lower levels of potential and high levels of risk. So, for example, the anti-room, that has high potential, but also very, very high risks. So where the risks outweigh the potential. So that would also be an area that we would delimit. They decided, this particular company decided to retain product country mix 9 And this was simply, you may think that this was rather unsystematic, but actually they did it because it was a loss leader. So actually product 9 supported the sales of product 20 and product 14, which were in the podium. So it was decided by this company to retain 9, even though it was slightly risky compared to its potential, and it was actually losing money. So this is our more strategic way of going in and selecting what kind of products and what kind of markets are we going into, first of all. And this is what, you know, when we're a certified expert at Institut-MEX and Mercadex, this triax approach is all about. So it's all about eliminating, and it's then all about prioritizing. We have to think, though, that it's not a static tool, that both the costs and the returns will be changing all the time. So, you know, you only have to, we've just talked about Sudan, for example, that's changed radically from one year to the next. So you go from dictatorship to civilian government to back to military rule. And the landscape for companies operating there changes radically. It's been the same with Iran. Iran's subject to sanctions, no longer sanctioned. Now it's sanctioned again. It changes the playing field for companies operating there. And as we talked about Russia also. So all around the world, it's the trends that are the most important. It's okay doing it as a snapshot, but we need to do it more regularly in order to make sure, are we still using the right strategy? Are we still prioritizing the right kind of product market mix? And this depends a lot on data. And we were just talking during the introductions about data. Raluca, you were talking that you gather a lot of data, and this, of course, is hugely important. So what data are we using to justify our decisions, to base our decisions on? And a lot of that is secondary data, using composite indices, for example. And that is okay to a certain degree, but it's not necessarily designed, it isn't designed for our particular product. So we often need to complement secondary data with primary data. So how do we gain market analysis information on a particular market? How do we engage consultants or analysts of a particular market before we actually move into it? These are very, very important steps. I talked a little bit about market potential, and this is how we assess market potential. So market potential is a function of the total number of customers. That's not necessarily the population, of course. These are the people that would actually be using the product. And so if it's children's toys, then it's the number of children in the economy, in the society. And then the average sales price. And then Q is the average annual consumption. So if it's toothpaste and we use a tube of toothpaste once a month, then the average annual consumption is 12. If we're buying a washing machine and we buy a washing machine every 5 years, then the average annual consumption's 0.2. And then, of course, we have to multiply that by our market share. So if we're taking toothpaste and we're selling, let's say, to Ethiopia, they've got 120 million people. Maybe there's some old people that don't use it. Maybe there's some babies that are not using it. So say 100 million people. The average sales price might be $1. Average annual consumption, 12. So you're multiplying 100 million by 1 by 12. And then let's say you have 20% market share in similar markets around the world. Then you multiply it by 0.2. And that gives you an idea of your market potential in that particular country. We also, yes, Falk.
Which kind of quantity data you will use for your example? Where you can find it in general, which kind of quantity data you will use?
Yeah, this is a good question. This will be a combination of secondary data and internal data. So, for example, total number of customers, we can pretty much guess with. Okay, I'll back up a little bit. If you've got a demand, which is what's called functional demand, that means that the demand doesn't change according to economic cycles, according to seasons or whatever. The demand can be predicted to a very, very high level of accuracy. So if we take toothpaste as an example, that's what we call a functional demand. So your demand for toothpaste will be exactly the same as everybody else's demand for toothpaste in this call. So we all brush our teeth either twice or 3 times a day. It's not that we go several days without brushing our teeth. It's not that we suddenly brush our teeth 50 times a day. So we can predict with a great level of accuracy how many people are likely to be using our toothpaste. And we can predict with a great deal of accuracy what the average annual consumption is going to be. The average sales price, this of course is internal, so you would have to think, how would you price it in that particular market? And of course, pricing in different countries is a big science. So firms price in lots of different ways. Some firms price in terms of what we call markup pricing. So you simply take all your costs and then you add a margin and then you sell it at that price. Other firms do what's called competitive based pricing. So you simply see what all the other competitors selling toothpaste are doing, and then you aim for some price in the middle so that you know that your price is going to be quite competitive. Others do what's called value-based, but that's much more services like consultancy or software development or architects or something like this, where firms can charge very, very differential prices for their services. And in terms of firm market share, this would also largely be internal information. So you might think, okay, we're going into Ethiopia. We've never done that before, but what does it look like in markets which are similar to Ethiopia? So what's our market share in the countries we are present in? So if we're present in Egypt or we're present in Indonesia, for example. So you take markets at a similar level of maturity, and then you would say, okay, maybe we've got 20% market share in these countries. Then you can use that as an estimator for what the market potential is going to be in Ethiopia. So it's a combination of secondary data, it's a combination of internal data, and in some cases it can also be primary data. So it's unlikely it's going to be the case for toothpaste, but I did a consultancy report in Yemen for bringing in humanitarian food and medicine during the Saudi blockade. And this was a very, very interesting consultancy report because obviously hugely important. How do you bring in grains, for example? What do people use the grains for? What type of flour is being used? What are the preferences? What types of cooking use what types of flour? How's the flour distributed? You know, if you don't know anything about Yemen, you would never be able to get this information. And of course, Yemen's not the kind of country that has a lot of secondary data that's reliable. So, you know, we formed, my partner and I, we formed an alliance with a consultant in Yemen that was a market analyst that could simply provide us with all that information. He knew how people cooked, what types of flour, what types of grains were being needed, what types were preferred in certain regions. You know, is it seasonal or is it the same kind of demand across the year? What kind of festivals spike demand, and all kinds of things like this. So in this case, where secondary data is very difficult to obtain or very unreliable, then you need to engage services you need to get primary data. And a lot of firms are doing what we call ethnographic studies, where you actually identify how do people use your product or products that are similar in that particular country. So food companies are following how people shop in markets by following them around and looking at the markets, or going into restaurants and seeing what's on the menu, or chatting with chefs, finding out what kind of produce is important, how a recipe is changing over time, and such like. So in this case, you need very deep ethnographic or anthropological data, understanding how people use things. So this requires a lot of patience and a lot of time to get the right kind of market data here.
So we can say, in general, you're based on a second data and a qualitative data more than of a primary data, or not?
Yeah, I would say if you're going for markets where the data is more plentiful and where the data is more reliable. So if I'm selling toothpaste in Norway, yeah, as a new toothpaste company in Norway, I can get all the information I need can be secondary data. Yeah. If I'm going into DRC, for example, then I might, for the same product, I might need to have a lot more primary data to know how to do that. And of course, the advantage of secondary data is it's cheap and it's fast, but it's not customized to what you want it for. The advantage of primary data is that it's customized. You've commissioned someone to investigate, and that gives you a competitive advantage, because of course primary data is just for you, but of course it's enormously time consuming to get of data. So there are a lot of people that use forecasting techniques. I'll just choose one of those, for example, chain ratio methods. So let's say, for example, we want to find out what the potential is of washing machines in Vietnam. We know that it's not everyone in a country that needs a washing machine. Typically, one household will have one washing machine. So knowing the population, knowing that there's 92 million people, that doesn't really help us. We need to know what the household size is. So let's assume it's like 4.5 people on average in a household. Then there will be 20 million households. And then we need to know how many of these actually have access to electricity. Not everywhere is on the grid that has access to electricity. So that also delimits a lot of people. So let's say 60% of these have access to electricity. And of course, you also need running water to have a washing machine. So there's also a lot of areas that don't have running water in Vietnam. So let's say 40% have access to it. And then, of course, because it's a relatively expensive item, you need purchasing power. So let's say 70% have got the purchasing power to buy that. If you then do the maths here and multiply these, that gives just under 3.4 million sales of washing machines every single year. So this is also a way of estimating what the market potential is if we don't know exactly. And then, of course, we would have to multiply that by the market share in order to develop an assessment of what kind of market there is for us. Are you ready for a break? We haven't quite got as far as I would ideally like to have got, but it doesn't matter. I'll just speed up a little bit. But let's have a break now for 15 minutes, unless you have any questions. Otherwise, we'll resume again at 4:15 Paris time.
I have a question,
Yes,
sir.
of course.
But
Yes.
if anyone has to take the break, no problems. I can wait for that. But about the market share, you told us about the primary data and secondary data. I found a bit difficult to rely on data for Eastern Africa countries. So for one of my clients, we had to go in Kenya and Nigeria for launching a product.
Yeah.
But before even doing some kind of research about the market potential and everything like that, we went on the field to see how it is. We get some, like you said, a bit of empiric experience, asking like
Yeah.
survey to people. But we realized that in a scale of the countries or even the regions, it's really, really hard to get access to reliable data. Like, should we go with uh, companies? Should we go with the data that our competitors allowed us to see, or should we go with instinct on those things?
Can you, are you in a position that you can share a little bit more information about what the product or the
Yeah,
service
yeah.
is?
So it's a French companies about constructions materials.
Okay.
So like cement, like wood, steel, and everything.
Yeah.
And they went to Kenya back a few years ago, a few decades ago, and it was about they were in Mauritius and Reunion Island, and they wanted to expand. They get the maturity, they get the cash, they've been doing the risk and the potentials, and they saw that they have, as Mr. David says to us yesterday, they had a competitive, let's say, qualities over their competitors. They
Yeah.
knew someone there personally, like a
Right.
relationship.
Yes.
Uh, that relations was with a bit of governments and a bit with local commerciants people there. So they said, okay, we'll go there, we'll see by ourselves how it is. And they feel that, yes, it could be a good market because there's a demand. People are using this. There's like a purchasing power, but they don't have like, uh, framework that we are used to with the French way to do it with credit and debit, and you putting the risk, you putting how much it will cost you with the bank, insurance, and blah blah blah. And they were trying to get the data. They were trying to get data with bank, with governments, with local, but it's not that people don't give the data, it's that people don't have the data, or at least people have data but in their own way. Like everyone has a bias. So if you're asking the banking guy, they have their kind of experience, so they will tell you this is not good, this is good. If you're going to see the entrepreneur guy, they will tell you this is an opportunity, or as the banking said, you is a threat. Or if you go to see the government guy, because he has another mindset or he don't have the same KPIs, he will tell you otherwise. So they had a lot of different, let's say, advices about data, about that countries, about um, steel and construction materials. So they said, okay, we'll make a try, and it was a fail because they realized that the data was not that good for their business.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is a very interesting case because I presume they're selling construction materials to construction companies in Kenya, for example.
So they wanted to go that, but the people from there told them to go, no, go as distributors. So you're going as a grossist.
Yes.
So it's better for you to control the supply chains, and you
Yes.
can invest a bit to get a warehouse, and you go as distributors. But
Yes.
they mingle with a partner there, but it was a fail.
Yeah, this is an interesting case because what they have done effectively, if I understand it correctly, is they've set up a sales subsidiary. So they have their head office in Mauritius or Reunion, as you say. They move into Kenya. They have their own sales subsidiary. They transport the products to their warehouse, their own owned warehouse. So they'll provide the logistics and such like typically. And their responsibility then is to go around construction companies trying to sell the materials to them.
Yes.
So if I understand, so in other words, they've made quite a large market investment to set up their own sales office there, to set up their own warehouse there.
Exactly. It was the gambling. They said that they prefer to do that.
Yeah. And of course, you know, the construction market, the first thing I would do is the demand for their products is not so much the demand from the construction companies, it's the derived demand from the people wanting to buy houses or the companies wanting to move into office blocks or something like that. So the first thing I would be looking at is saying, okay, who are they selling? Who are the construction companies selling to primarily? So are they selling to the government? Is it for a hospital or a school or something? Are they selling to businesses, for example, office blocks that businesses can move into? Or are they selling to private individuals, so people who want to build their own homes? In Africa, as you undoubtedly know, there's a very, very high degree of self-build. So people build their own houses.
Exactly.
And when they build their own houses, it typically takes years and years because they can get a little bit of financing for the first floor, and then they need more financing for the walls, and then more financing for the windows. And it's quite a protracted process. And for this reason, many of the houses are never completed because property companies could go bankrupt, or you know, you run out of money, or you have an accident or something. So I would be looking at who are they actually selling to. First of all, this would be crucial, what segment that they're going into. And then I would be saying what's driving the demand for buildings. This is also rather interesting because construction is a very cyclical business. You only have to have a look at China. What's going on at China at the moment? Construction companies failing so much. If you read The Economist this morning, they're talking about actually threatening the entire growth of China is the collapse of the construction companies because of this housing bubble. We're looking at lots of factors like the rate of interest. Yeah, this is a massive factor as a driver of demand. So rates of interest are going up because inflation levels are going up globally. This means its borrowing costs go up, and accordingly demand declines for new buildings. So companies, I would be looking at debt levels. So there's a lot of corporate debt levels, very high levels of household debt that simply mean that people need to repay or service this debt, and they simply haven't got the money for large capital items, such as a new house or expanding new offices, for example. So there's a lot of macro factors. There's a lot of economic factors in terms of economic cycles that would give me an idea of what kind of demand there would be in the market for this. And then I would, of course, be relating that to Kenya. So, you know, to what extent are these buildings being paid for by the government? What kind of debt does the government have? Is the government borrowing from China, and China's beginning to close the taps a little bit of their money because they're worried that they may not be repaid? I would also be looking at the costs of transportation. One thing we know, for example, about cement in Africa, cement in Africa is 4 times as expensive as the global price for cement. And this is simply because the logistics is not very good. This goes to the hard infrastructure that Falk was asking about.
Mm-hmm.
If that's, you know, if you haven't got the hard infrastructure in some of these areas, then transportation costs of cement and timber and steel and so on are hugely costly, and simply mean that you might not be able to complete the project on budget or on time. So I would be looking at a lot of these factors as well before I would even go into the market. They've committed themselves a little bit too much. I would definitely have chosen a less committed entry mode. I would have used partners, specifically an agent. So an agent who specifically works for that company in Kenya, for example, and who would drive around the construction companies trying to work out how much demand there would be. And then I would have an importer who would act as a wholesaler. This is also typically the case in many countries. So you would have somebody to import your products, do all the paperwork and so on, but also act as a wholesaler and then sell to all these construction companies.
You're right about that kind of possibility of entries. The thing is, because they're trying to get access to data, one of the advice of people from there give them was that don't go with a partner, because at that time corruption was a bit more high in Kenya, and they was afraid that people will take advantage of these partnerships to go directly with the purchaser and bring by himself the product. That's why they
Yeah.
went for that.
Yeah, this is a good point. And as we talked about, there are certain sectors which are more corrupt than others. Kenya in itself is not the worst in terms of corruption, but construction is a very, very corrupt sector, generally speaking, in the West, by the way, because it's often a system of tender. So if you're working for a government and you're building a school or you're building a hospital, it's often a tender. And that process where you come with bids, and that process is often open to influence and corruption. So this could be quite problematic if you had a local firm to do this that already has relationships with government officials or local authorities. So it could be that you become a little cleaner, if you like, by not involving a local partner in that particular sector. So yeah, that could make good sense. So there's a host of factors. And yes, the data on that is quite difficult, because if we had lots of data, then we wouldn't be having the construction crisis that we are having in China, for example, at the moment. Yeah, so a lot of people don't have the right data. The data is not always reliable. And that's why we get these cycles, these economic cycles of boom and bust.
Thanks for your analysis.
Okay, you're most welcome. Thanks for sharing. So are we all on the call, or are we? Yeah, we're all on the call. Let's have a break. Can we just have a break for 10 minutes? Would that be okay? So it is 13. So if we come back at 23 past.
Okay.
Great. I'll see you all in 10 minutes. Great, welcome back, everyone. So I was just going to use a case here to illustrate the idea of market selection and also begin to think about entry modes as well. So I'll just go through it really quickly. And I was thinking we could have done it individually, but I think in the interest of time, we'll just discuss it in plenum. And the case itself is about oat milk. And just to give a quick summary of it, oat milk is an alternative to dairy milk. And there are several oat milk manufacturers, originally starting with a company called Oatly, based in Sweden. And they're competing essentially with two different types of producers. The first type of producer is the milk producer, so the dairy companies producing milk. And the second type of competitor they have is other forms of alternative milk. And alternative milk, and this could be soya milk, coconut milk, rice milk, almond milk, and so on. So in a way, the idea of oat milk is to switch people who have traditionally drunk cow milk to drink oat milk themselves. So first of all, you have to switch people to the idea of drinking alternative milk. And then after that, making sure that they're drinking oat milk rather than drinking almond milk or rice milk or soya milk. So that was the idea. And of course, Oatly, as the first mover, only actually makes oat milk, whereas other producers typically have quite a broad product category, a broad product range, where they make lots of different types of milk. Now, one of the advantages of alternative milks is, of course, that they're not, they are perfect for people who are lactose intolerant. And there are many people around the world, very high proportion of people on a global level who are lactose intolerant. So that is a big driver for alternative milks. And of course, oat milk is especially advantageous compared to other forms of alternative milk in various aspects. So it's much more sustainable, for example, in terms of its production techniques. It uses less water consumption, for example, than the production of almond milk or cow's milk. So there's a lot of people who are beginning to move towards oat milk out of sustainability concerns, environmental concerns, a lot of vegans, of course. We're seeing a rising movement of vegans around the world, and of course those who are lactose intolerant. So these are the main drivers, if you like, that are fueling the market for oat milk. And it's a rapidly growing market. So it was valued at around $13 billion US dollars back in 2021. And it is very, very important in terms of food service. So being served in restaurants, hotels, and so on, but also, of course, in retail. And if you take a company like Oatly, they generate around 50% of their income from food service and around 50% from retail. So it's driven by people who are environmentally focused. It's driven by people who are concerned about the ethical treatment of animals, people who are health conscious because oat milk contains a lot of very beneficial vitamins. And the competitors, as we mentioned, some of them in the oat milk sector are niche producers. So in other words, a bit like Oatly, all they do is oat milk and oat milk derivatives. Whereas other companies are the really big players within the food and beverage industries. So we've got people like Campbell's Soup, for example. We've got Danone, which is Europe's largest dairy producer, which acquired Alpro, which is a Belgian vegan drinks company that makes yogurts and all kinds of oat milks and rice milks and so on and so forth. So A lot of it now is being packaged as for the go-to drink market. So people buy them in cafes and shops and things like that, and you can take out a smaller carton and drink it. Otherwise, it's typically in the liter volumes that we see here in the picture in supermarkets. And to talk a little bit about Oatly, they were the first mover in this particular industry. They were the ones that actually formed founded the technology to make oat milk. And they had a very, very interesting strategy. They knew that nobody would be drinking oat milk initially because nobody had been exposed to it as a product. So there's no way that people would go into a retailer and see oat milk and buy it because they had no experience of it. So their strategy was based on going into cafes, coffee shops especially, and getting the baristas to get acquired the taste of oat milk so that they could start offering it to their customers in place of cow's milk. So this was their strategy. About 8 years ago, they actually started sending people directly to New York City. That was their first area because they thought this was the really big coffee culture area. And actually just talking to the baristas. So this very on the ground, like Adnan was talking about in Kenya, on the ground, trying to understand how do people come into the coffee shops? What are they buying? What are they consuming with it? How much milk do they need? Are they drinking it black? And so on and so forth. So a lot of ethnographic research. And by the end of the following year, they had already signed up 650 coffee shop locations. And then it was a two-stage strategy. So you go into the coffee shops where people get acquainted with the brand, they can see the brand. If they go into places like Starbucks, and then, of course, the idea is that they think they also would like to have that brand when they're at home. And they could use it with for breakfast, they could use it for coffees, they could use it for making food with, all kinds of different applications. So the idea then was to start targeting the retail industry. So supermarkets, hypermarkets, convenience stores like 7-Eleven, specialty stores that were natural food shops, etc., etc. And also forming a partnership with Amazon, that people would buy it online and it would be delivered in bulk to them in certain Western European countries. And by 2020, so in other words, 4 years after they had started this strategy in the US, they suddenly had over 32,000 coffee shops around the world and 60,000 retail stores. So as you can see, large numbers in the US and in China. And then they started developing new product variants. So using the oat milk to produce ice cream, yogurts, and so on. And by 2021, they'd added another 50,000 retail stores globally. They also, in terms of entry modes, started working on strategic partnerships. So with Starbucks, Coffee Fellows, which is based in München in Germany, and Deutsche Bahn, which is the train service in Germany, Virgin Voyages, the cruise ships. So all of their alternative milk was oat milk from Oatly. Lots of hotels, airline companies like Swiss had partnerships with them. So this was a very, very big area that they were in. And then they had an IPO, so they raised a lot of money in 2021. It was valued at $10 billion US. And this allowed it, of course, to expand geographically. In the last quarter this year, sales of 200 million US dollars. So it's quite a big market. And they're available in 30 countries, but relatively geographically concentrated. So they're concentrated in Asia, North America, and Europe. And that's it at the moment. They are, it's quite interesting that in different countries, the proportion of food service, restaurants, hotels, and so on, differs quite a lot. So in North America, it's 43%, whereas in Europe, what they call Europe and international, this is Middle East and Africa, for example. These are new markets for Oatly, but they're already beginning to make strategies for these markets. There, only 18% of the sales come from food service, so the vast majority from retail. But in China, the vast majority are actually coming from food service. So people going to coffee shops, going to restaurants and hotels on a much greater basis, and not so much buying at retail. Now, Oatly has had a very interesting production process because the demand for oat milk has just been growing exponentially for many of the reasons that we talked about before: health, ethics, sustainability, and so on. So they opened their first production facility in the Netherlands, outside of Sweden. And they chose the Netherlands because the Netherlands has the highest capita milk consumption in Europe. So more people drink more milk, cow's milk, in the Netherlands per person than any other European country. So their strategy here was to think, well, if people are drinking milk, they're drinking milk in coffees, they're using milk on their cereals and so on. Therefore, if we can convert them from cow's milk to oat's milk, then we will have very, very significant sales. This was the idea. Then, of course, the US, they have several factories in the US now, which is the big coffee culture. And going into Singapore as a prelude to going into China. Now they have 2 factories in China, and each of these factories makes around 150 million liters. And now, of course, in the UK, they have a factory in just outside London, in Cambridgeshire. So the only problem, though, was that they grew too fast. So they actually grew to a point where demand was so much greater than supply. Everybody wanted oat milk. Everyone wanted to go into coffee shops and buy oat milk. Everyone wanted to buy oat milk in the retailers. And Oatly simply couldn't follow because the production facilities took many, many years to build. So if you're only producing a fairly fixed supply, 150 million liters, and the demand is increasing exponentially, you have bottlenecks. In fact, they could only fulfill 70% of their orders from around the world using their existing production. This, of course, created reputational damage. There was quite a dramatic fall in their share price at one point from $20 down to $2. Because when you were unable to service your partners, especially people like Starbucks or Virgin Voyages, when you're not able to produce the oat milk that people are wanting, this creates great dissatisfaction. And the partners were forced into using alternative oat milk suppliers, so using competitors. And this is often very, very difficult for oat milk to get, or Oatly to get back into the market once they have been thrown out by a competitor because they've been unable to meet the demand. So what they've chosen to do is a strategy which is called asset-light production. And what that simply means is you don't do the production yourself. You own all the facilities that make all the oat milk, but you actually get a specialist company to come in and do all the bottling. So the bottling into these cartons, putting the lids on, packing them all, getting them ready for distribution. So they felt that that was a way that they could increase their supply a lot. And they've also been very vulnerable to changes in the supply chain, transportation costs, of course, and also the rising price of oats. So Bernard, you're based in Canada. There was a shortage of oats a couple of years ago. The oat harvest was very, very bad. And as a result, the price of oat milk went up 45% in Canada just on this basis. So it's very, very vulnerable to price shocks. Now, interestingly, they're in 3 areas of the world, 3 continents of the world, but the remaining areas are untouched at the moment. they are beginning to think about them. So they have just appointed a CEO for Latin America, who was a previous Danone executive, and they brought in some of his team, and they are hoping now that he will be able to help them expand into Latin America. So this has now been part of the Europe plus International division, as it's called. So my question to you, and I'd be very interested to hear your ideas, how would you actually go about eliminating markets for Oatly, and how would you prioritize them? So I was going to think that you could maybe have done this individually, but I think in the interest of time, let's just take it in open forum here and hear your ideas. So how would you actually do it now? If you are Senor Sapina in dealing with the Latin American market for Oatly, how would you begin to eliminate markets? How would you do that? Because here we're looking at quite a lot of markets. There are lots of costs associated with going into them. How would you eliminate them, and how would you prioritize them? What do you think?
If someone needs to jump, first you distinguish the markets that are stable and the markets that are not stable. So Venezuela can be problematic, and there are quite others.
Yeah, very nice. So we would automatically go in and delimit the ones that are politically unstable. And as you say, that's Cuba, it's Haiti, it's Venezuela. So we could probably go in automatically and say, okay, we've got maybe 30 countries here. How would we just delimit them immediately? And why would political stability be important, Bernard, in the case of Oatly?
Because that's a good question. Because of the distribution network. So in prior or before, they were selling products to coffee shops, and then they went to retail. So coffee shops, you need to have stable coffee shops, because I remember Togo, I had a contract there, and they managed to sell rice and stuff like that in little market. And I don't think that the oat milk is the best product to be sold in little informal markets, because there's a lot of transaction over there. So I would prefer to have a nice place that is cool, and also people that are like a modern thinking, that they can see alternative to milk. So you want people that have more education, that will be able to but I was not any elimination. I was so you would eliminate people where there's not much education.
Very nice. Yes. So these are some excellent ideas, because you're quite right. In many of these countries, we have informal markets. So street food, where people are selling in small shops. And one thing we know about these small shops is they don't have very much space, and they have products, they rely on products that there's a high turnover, and they know they can turn over lots and lots of them every single day. Oat milk is, of course, an uncertainty in many of these markets. So they're not going to want to have an entire shelf of oat milk and think that they may sell one a month. So you're also needing the infrastructure, in the sense that you need refrigerated facilities, and that's not always the case. So you need this cold chain, if you like, and if you don't have this cold chain in retail, then it's not ideal for storing oat milk. It needs to be kept chilled. So many of these countries, they simply won't have a mature enough retail sector that would allow you to deliver in bulk, to have bulk storage, and to be able to have many shelves in the supermarket devoted to oat milk. So that would definitely be a way of looking at it. How would you be able to, Bernard, if I can press you a little bit on this, what kind of data would you be looking for to determine whether a market would be informal or whether it would be more modern? What kind of indicators would you be using there?
I guess there's data from the World Bank on informal markets and on regular markets.
Yes.
I would also make the distinction between capitals like Lima in Peru, where that would be a good market, and more the country and the mountains and stuff like that, not very good. So also get data of more on a urban places more than the country. So focus urban.
Yeah, this is very interesting. So lots of points here. We might look at to what extent are there Western retailers in these countries? Is Carrefour present? Is Walmart present? And so on, because that could give us an idea of the maturity of the retail market and what kind of infrastructure there is in terms of the cold chain. So that could be rather interesting. And I also like your idea about modern thinking here, because it's true that in a way, education is correlated with people's preferences in terms of health, in terms of exercise, in terms of diet, and so on. So yes, we could be looking at countries there that have a certain level of secondary school education or a level of university education, for example, because there is definitely a positive correlation there. And that would be relatively easy to obtain that type of data. And you're also right that educated people tend to be living more in the urban areas than in the rural areas. So this would also be an important factor. Can we choose the urban areas, sorry, which are close to ports, for example? Lima could be a perfect example. Rather than choosing countries like Bolivia, which are landlocked, that might be quite difficult to get into, for example. And of course, you know, the geography or topography of the country is important, because we've got lots of countries here with rainforests, with the Andes, and so on, that mean that it's just too expensive to try to transport goods, which have a very low value compared to their volume. Yeah, it's great if you're selling watches or diamonds that have a very high value compared to their volume. But for oat milk, you know, you're selling for $1, you're selling a liter. So you're not making that much money for quite a lot of. So you need to keep your transportation costs down as much as possible.
And for Brazil, you have to check the custom duties and the taxation.
Yeah, so we're looking at tariffs. Yeah, one thing we do know is that Latin America is characterized by being quite protectionist. So many of these countries, especially Brazil, are very protectionist. And what we mean by that is they put up barriers to trade in many cases, because Brazil, for example, actually has a very high alternative milk market. It produces a lot of soya. It's one of the world's leading suppliers of soya. So it has its own alternative milk market, and it would want to keep firms like Oatly out of that country for as much as possible. So we have policies in international economics. They're called import substitution policies, where countries actually try to prevent imports from coming in and then support their own industries. And of course, if you've got a large enough domestic population, you can do that. So it might mean that Brazil is a non-starter because of these barriers. It could mean that your $1 liter of oat milk suddenly becomes $2, and that suddenly might therefore be, not feasible for the purchasing power of the people.
Unless you partner with one of the conglomerate that sells similar product.
Yes, and this could be a nice idea. So now we're beginning to think a little bit about entry modes. So we're presuming that we're exporting rather than opening a factory in the first instance. So if
No,
we're
or
exporting,
Or
sorry,
giving a license.
yeah, or it could be a license. Yeah, a license could be a very nice way of doing it. So we could find even cow milk producers that could be licensed to produce the oat milk, and you pay a licensing fee, and they would then ensure the distribution together with their cow's milk, so they would have a wider product variety, and this could be a very nice strategy, because it's a very low cost strategy. It's a low commitment strategy. You're using the production facilities of another company, which makes it, in a way, some kind of complementary good or a non-competing good. So that could be a nice strategy there.
I see that here. I have a client using the brand Del Monte.
Yes,
Del
pineapples.
Monte is a fully licensed business.
Yes, and licensing is a little bit like franchising. You're using the resources of another company, in this case, the licensee. So you don't have the production facilities. You basically license them, so you share the recipe, and they then produce it according to that. And they're also responsible for the distribution. So you don't have to take care of that either. And typically they're brand names. So they have access to all the retailers. They have access to all the food service, hospitality companies. So you have that way into the market that you wouldn't have otherwise. So this is a very useful mode of entry for many firms involved in food and beverage. Yeah.
But I'll let the other
thank you.
You have more knowledge than I do on this.
For your ideas. Have you left anything for anyone else? Let's see. Who else would like to? Yes, Raluca.
Yes.
You're our resident expert in international marketing. What would you?
No, I think it's really important. I mean, the main elements were already discussed regarding and the entry barriers that the countries might put into practice, and also distribution facilities. And also Bernard talked about all those entry mode arrangements that could be used. But also maybe if you said something really interesting. You talked about Brazil, saying that they produce themselves soya milk. So maybe this is a very important element in all the other countries. If they produce this indirect competitor products that could substitute the oat milk. And also you said something that you talked about lactose intolerance, and I was wondering maybe if there are some countries where a lot of people are lactose intolerant, because changing consumption habits might be complicated. But if a lot of lactose intolerant people live in a certain country, this could be a strong point for selling oat milk, I assume. And also the vegans, I don't know if in some of the Latin American countries you have more vegans than in other markets.
These are very, very good points. Yes, indeed, Raluca. And I can tell you that there is data available, secondary data, instantly available for lactose intolerance around the world by countries. There's also data on veganism. It's obviously not 100% scientific, because some people call themselves vegan and they still drink milk. Or they, there are different varieties of them in a way. The strict definition, of course, is you don't drink you don't have any form of dairy products if you're vegan. But there's quite a lot of data out there, and countries like Brazil have actually a very, very high level of vegans proportionately. It's one of the highest proportion of vegans percentages of the society around the world. So there are certain countries that have a disproportionate number of vegans. Taiwan, for example. Israel is one of the highest levels of vegans in the world. Germany has very, very high levels in Europe, for example. The UK also. So there are certain countries for various reasons that have very, very high levels, but that data is typically readily available on the internet. So this would give us an idea of what kind of numbers we're talking about there. And of course, we have to multiply that by the population size. Yeah. So if I can't remember exactly how much it was in Brazil, but something like 4 or 5% are vegans or classify themselves as vegans. But you've got a population of about 220 million people. So when you start looking at 5% of 220 million, it's a significant amount. That's 11 million people. So, which is more than the population of many of these other countries. So we would be looking at the level of lactose intolerance. We'd be looking at the level of veganism, health awareness, and so on, and then multiplying that by the population. And things like health awareness, we could go in and look at things like gym subscriptions. You know, how many people are doing regular exercise, regular training, because we're more likely to get someone who's very fitness oriented to move over to alternative milks than somebody who doesn't do any exercise at all. So the empirical evidence would suggest that's the case. So obviously it's quite difficult to know how we assess the level of exercise in a country, but we could do something like gym memberships as a health club memberships or something as a proxy for that to give us an idea. Yeah, very nice. Any other thoughts?
Maybe about the level of competition. If there are brands which are very well established, sometimes it's complicated to enter a market also.
Yeah, this is a good point. And when we go back to the competition here, we can actually see that many of these are US firms. So most of these niche producers are US firms. Campbell Soup, of course, also US. So it could be that the US has a big advantage in terms of being able to come into the Latin American markets. So it could very well be that it's difficult to displace the rivals, yeah, that are already in the market. Because one thing we know about coffee shops is that you go into a coffee shop and you ask for oat milk in your cafe latte, for example. It's not that you get offered 10 different types of oat milk. There is only the one that they then put into the coffee. If you go, so to get that replaced by yours is actually quite difficult. And also, especially in retail, if you go to a modern retailer that's got refrigerated, and you say to them, okay, can you now remove all the other forms of oat milk because we would like to sell ours? Yeah, they have to trade the certainty of their knowledge of an existing product with the uncertainty of taking over your product. So this could be quite difficult. On the other hand, Oatly is producing in the US. It actually has 3 factories, including one in Texas. So it could be logistically quite easy to go into countries like Mexico, for example, going across the border. Obviously, I think the island states that we see here would be out of the question at the moment because of transportation costs. But having said that, a lot of vegans, a lot of healthy people are coming from the US, are coming from Europe, and they're vacationing in places like Dominican Republic and Jamaica. And they will want hotels that have oat milk, for example. They will want to go to coffee shops that have oat milk. So there could actually be a lot of demand by looking at the travel sector and looking at where do the vast majority of oat milk drinkers, what countries do they come from, and where do they typically go on vacation? So these could also be secondary data that could be used to gain some kind of assessment as to the potential of a market.
Mm-hmm. Maybe also the level of the prices that are actually, used in the market.
Yeah, very good. Because we know that oat milk sells, it retails for, on average, around 3 times a litre of cow's milk. It depends a little bit, but in most markets, around 3 times. So most people who are price conscious, if we're dealing with markets that are fairly elastic, where people haven't got that much purchasing power, they're not going to change from cow's milk to alternative milks like oat milk. So price may have a big factor. And if we're looking at tariffs that Bernard was mentioning earlier, that increases the price of imported goods. That simply might mean that local people don't have the purchasing power for that. It could be that the price of soya milk, because it's locally grown, is a lot cheaper than the price of imported oat milk. I don't think Brazil has an oat industry as such. So that tends to be more the northern climates. So that could be a factor also that means that people stay with soya milk. Even those that don't want cow's milk, they would rather stay with soya milk than go to oat milk. One thing we do know, though, is that evidence suggests that people who are better educated, and that's positively correlated with exercise, it tends to be positively correlated with dietary habits such as veganism, but they also tend to have more money.
Mm-hmm.
So it could very well be that they are willing to pay, and they have the ability to pay, $1 for a carton of oat milk, for example. Yeah, excellent. Any other thoughts at all? So there are lots of factors. So what we're doing here is we're looking at the primary drivers that we're listing. And this could be levels of lactose intolerance. It could be levels of veganism. It could be exercise and such like. These would be part of our returns. And then we would also be looking at the entry ticket, which would be our risks. These would be tariffs. It would be problems with purchasing power and so on. And of course, what we need to do in order to delimit these countries is actually to go in and find some form of data that we can have some cutoff point. So it could be that we look at the number of vegans multiplied by the population. And if that amount is less than, let's say, 1 million people or 5 million people, then you simply eliminate that market. So this would be eliminating markets that have got high levels of veganism, but very, very small populations. They would be less interesting in a volume-based industry. At the same time, big populations, but with low levels of veganism, that would equally be uninteresting. So you're looking at this interaction effect. And there you could simply say 5 million people, and that would maybe delimit the vast majority of markets. We might be left to Colombia, Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil, for example. And then, yes, Falk.
Maybe only 1 second. Okay, you will compare countries like Brazil, Paraguay, and so on. Only for Brazil. If I want to go to do business in Brazil, it's maybe not all over the Brazil, because Manaus is not the same like Fortaleza, it's not the same like Sao Paulo, like Rio. But I can only take care about Sao Paulo and Rio, for example, only some cities. And there will be a very big market, and it's quite different to any other city. So also it's very big country. And also Peru, also Argentina, the south, you cannot really compare to the north. maybe Germany is very small country. You can compare Denmark. You can compare, but also Sweden, the north is quite different to the north.
Yeah, you're quite right. So within any
Only for
one
entrance
country,
strategies. So sometimes I think it's only to figure maybe some cities, or it's like China on the
Yeah.
east coast, some cities, okay, but it's not all over the country.
No. And in fact, you know, the vast majority of people in Western China are living on less than $2 a day, for example. So it's, and yet you've got, you know, a city like Beijing, which has the highest level of dollar billionaires on the planet. So there's huge diversity. And you're quite right, a country like Brazil, which is so large, you're probably looking at one or two cities. So just like they went into the US in New York City to start with, you would undoubtedly go into Rio, which is the healthiest, but also Sao Paulo, which is even bigger than Rio and has a much more of a coffee culture because it's the business, the industry hub of Brazil. Rio, of course, has a lot of tourism, so that could also be a good reason. So yes, you could definitely limit it to certain cities there. And other countries, it simply might not be viable because the cities are simply too small. Yeah. So for you to go into. And of course, it relates a little bit to the ease of doing business. So is it going to be difficult doing business in Brazil? Is it going to be difficult to find licensee partners if that's what we choose to do, or bring our products in through the ports? You know, we can bring them into Rio. It's quite expensive then transporting it to Sao Paulo. So these could also be factors. So it might very well be that we would start off in a very small scale to start with. We would go into Sao Paulo and Rio, and then we would see how that goes. And then we would maybe think next we'll try Mexico City, we'll try Santiago or wherever, yeah, and base it on that. So we're putting our toe into Latin America. But one of the things we know is it may be better. Let's say we're thinking about building a factory there, because one thing we know about Oatly is that they establish demand in a particular country, the UK, the US, China, and then they build a factory. Yeah, so it's that sequence that they go in. And this makes great sense. This goes back to what Adnan was talking about in Kenya, that they did it in a way the other way around. They started committing resources without actually knowing what the market potential was. Oatly, it's a little bit more scientific in that sense. So we would also be thinking, okay, let's say that our products are successfully received in these countries. If our next step is to build a factory, where would be a good location to build the factory? Yeah, would it be good to build it in Brazil? Would it be better to build it in Argentina? Because we're looking at lots of factors, the cost of land, we're looking at the infrastructure, we're looking at the amount of workers that could be available to deal with this. Can we get a specialist third-party company to come in and do all the bottling for us? So all of these kind of factors could mean that we decide to choose the country that we want to go into in the first instance as a licensee, for example, before we actually go in and start our own production subsidiary and start producing the products ourselves. So we have lots of different options open to us. So in some countries, Oatly exports. So you simply get a delivery at a port, and then that's distributed to wholesaler and retailers. In other countries, it could be using licensing, as we talked about. We could have our own facilities, as they have in Singapore and China and such like. And in Singapore, for example, their strategy was, well, Singapore doesn't have a big market. I mean, it's a small country, but it has very, very stable political institutions. The easiest country to do business in on the planet. So there are many firms that set up their headquarters in smaller countries Luxembourg is a classic example to go into the French market or the German market. You go into Singapore as the stepping stone to going into China. You go into, in Latin America, many of the firms are choosing to go to Uruguay, which has very, very strong institutions and has borders with Argentina and Brazil. So you're on the, this would be the springboard strategy. You go into a smaller country, which has very strong institutions, where it's easy to set up business, where it's not corrupt, where processes are transparent, and then you export across the border into Brazil and into Argentina, for example. So that could also be an interesting strategy.
So that's why I think it's very very important. For example, for the Brazil, for China, Taiwan, Japan, Morocco, and some other countries. It depends very much your product or your service and the entrance strategy, and it's very local, and it's not all over the country.
Yeah.
And in the same way, in this kind of country, it depends a lot of your relationship, I think.
Yes, exactly.
It's very important.
Yeah, definitely. And can you trust? Because when you have relationships, for example, with a licensee, or you have a relationships with an agent, you're reliant on contracts, and you're reliant on the rule of law. Yes. So can people uphold these contracts? I know contracts can also be spoken contracts as well. But if you're having a licensee, for example, you need the licensee to play by the rules of the game and not just produce their own version of your oat milk.
I'm really agree with you. But it's also Bernard is hearing us. There's a legal things, there are legal things in business, and after then there's
and this is why many companies choose to set up in a much smaller country that has big neighbors, but where that small country has much stronger institutions, where the rule of law is stronger, where ease of doing business is stronger, for example. So if you go to Adnan, you also mentioned Nigeria. I mean, most people go into Nigeria after they set up in Ghana to start with. Yeah, so you go into Ghana, you set everything up, you get acquainted with that part of West Africa, and then when you've got knowledge, then you begin to move into Nigeria. You don't start in the Nigerian market. That's too unpredictable. It's too risky. So you, in a way, you choose a small country. We call it cherry picking. So you don't just choose the obvious one. You go into a small country that has very strong institutions like Singapore, but which is on the doorstep of large markets.
So what I understand from your statement, you would choose Uruguay.
If you were thinking about doing your own bottling facilities, yes, you would probably, if you would obviously have to take into account land costs and such like, but if you were thinking in terms of setting everything up, in terms of all the contracts you need for hiring people and such like, it might make good sense to do it in Uruguay. But obviously it depends a little bit. If the tariffs of coming into Brazil are really high, Mercosur, the trade agreement in Latin America, is not really as strong as in many other regions. So it's kind of fallen apart to a large extent. So it could be, even though you're in Uruguay, you still have to face the tariffs of going into Brazil. If that is the case, then it's more logical to produce in Brazil, if that's the market you think would be the most interesting, most attractive market to go into. If you're licensing, then yes, it might be you find out who's got the best, which licensing partners would be the most attractive to choose. It could be that you've got someone in Mexico, for example. It could be you have someone in Colombia, and those are the ones then you choose. So the availability of partners is hugely important here. So just talking about export modes, I just wanted to touch upon that because we're finishing in about 15 minutes or so. And this case with oat milk is very interesting because we're trying to make decisions based on what we think the export mode would be. What would be the ideal way of moving into Latin America? Would we do it just as exporting? Would we have some kind of intermediate here where we're forming some relationship, some partnership with another company? So this could be the license agreement that we've talked about, which could be a really good way of doing it. It could also be some form of joint venture. So we could have a joint venture with a local dairy company, for example, in Brazil. And they take care of, so you form your own company. Maybe you take care of the production facilities. They take care of the distribution. And you split the profits 50-50 or 49-51 or however it is. It could also be that you choose some form of hierarchical mode of entry. That could be a subsidiary. You could have your own greenfield investment where you simply build a factory like they've just done in the UK or in China. It could be some form of acquisition. You take over a local oat milk producer or alternative milk producer and start producing them there. And as you move along the arrow here, you're committing more and more resources. And of course, that is good in the sense you get more control, and you have got control over how you operate, what pricing systems you use, what segmentation strategies you use. So you have the control over your own decisions. But of course, as you move further to the right, there's also much more risk associated with that. So with Adnan's example in East Africa, there's a lot of risk by going in and having your own sales subsidiary. There are exit barriers if you have to leave, if you simply underestimate the market, or if you underestimate the competition, for example. And I wanted to actually leave you with this slide here. So this is a colleague of mine. Yes, Falk, yes.
Excuse me, can you come back to the other slide before?
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit more about hierarchies, please?
Yes. So we use the word hierarchy for an organization, a firm, where everything takes place within the firm itself. So that's what we call a hierarchy. So let's say a firm acquires another firm. Yes, then that acquired firm becomes a part of your overall company. So you own it 100%. So with export and hierarchies, you own them, you own that company 100%. Yeah. If you decide to build your own factory, for example, and it's what we call a wholly owned subsidiary, then you own that 100%. So that's entirely yours. So that's the term that we use. The export, the difference is because with export, you produce in what we call the home country. So you'd be producing in Sweden, and then you would be selling it in, for example, Belgium. Belgium would be what we call the host country. So you produce in the home country, you sell to the host country. Whereas with the hierarchy, the difference is you're producing in the host country. Yeah. So you've got big advantages in terms of you have a much higher profile, you have lower transportation costs, you don't have the tariffs, you get to know the market much better. So there are lots of factors that mean that hierarchies are a really good idea. So a hierarchy in an organizational sense is simply 100% owned by the company itself. When we look at the intermediates that we also call hybrids, these are a combination. So this is your company with another company or more than one partner. So these are often what we call strategic partnerships. So it could be an alliance, it could be a license agreement. And of course, the big advantage of the intermediates is that you're not just doing everything yourself, you're doing it with another company. And typically that other company is a host country company. so they know the market. A licensee, for example, will know, how do we get the raw materials? We've got all the people in the factory. How do we distribute it? They have all the relationships with the retailers. So you have all that knowledge, but in another firm. Yeah, it's all external networks that are important. So you don't often have a lot of risk because you're sharing that risk with another company. That other company allows you to internationalize faster. So we're finding many firms that are using licensing and franchising to expand globally because you're using the resources of other companies rather than just your own resources. Yeah. And joint ventures are an intermediate, but they're what we call an equity intermediate. So in other words, company A and company B come together and they contribute money, typically money. It could also be a factory or something as well. And then you create a third company. So company A and B come together and create a new legal entity, which is called company C. That would be a joint venture. And typically the host country partner wants 51%. They want the majority share. So if you're setting up a joint venture in Nigeria or in China or wherever, the local partner will typically be the one that has the majority stake in that company. So did that answer your question, Pat?
Yes, thanks.
Yeah, perfect. So the last 10 minutes or so, I just wanted to leave you with this slide here. This is actually a colleague of mine, or a former colleague of mine. And what he did here was he started by looking at the pink box that you see on the right here. What actually affects the entry mode decision? And what he looks at here is that the more pluses there are, the plus sign, then the more you should be moving towards a hierarchical mode. So in other words, a wholly owned subsidiary, a greenfield investment, an acquisition, something where you own that 100% in the host country market. If you've got lots of minuses, then you should use the export mode. Yeah, so you shouldn't have any presence in the host country. And if it's between the two, so if you've got a fairly equal number of pluses and minuses, then you should choose an intermediate mode. So let's say we're Oatly. Oatly, we could export. We could use an intermediate mode like licensing, or we could use a hierarchical mode where we build our own factory and produce the oat milk in the factory, produce 150 million liters of it a year. So what he's done here is he's had a look at all the factors that can actually affect this decision. So let's just take one or two of them. We talked about the desired mode characteristics before. If you're risk averse, if your company is risk averse, then that's a minus sign. So that would be more towards exporting. Yeah. So if you're worried about risk, if you're very risk conscious, or if you haven't got that much money to start with, so going into a new country is very risky, then it's better to do an export. On the other hand, if you want control, that's a plus sign. There again, you get more control the more hierarchical you are. International experience. Yes, if you've got lots of international experience, then typically your perceptions of the uncertainty of doing business in a market go down. So that would be a plus, that would be hierarchical. If we have a look at things like transaction costs. So Bernard, I'm not sure whether you have studied transaction cost economics, but this is all about the costs of writing, monitoring and enforcing contracts. If those costs are very, very high because you're worried about what we call opportunistic behavior, in other words, a partner cheating you in some way, stealing your designs, stealing your intellectual property, stealing your recipes. If you're worried about that, then obviously you have to spend more and more resources on transaction costs, on writing contracts, monitoring and enforcing them in courts of law. So when those are very high, then again, it's a plus. So there you would choose more hierarchical ones where you don't actually need to have a partner, yeah, where you're doing everything within the hierarchy, within the organization itself.
You know, I believe really into nourishing relationship. Therefore, contract can be good, but it's not everything. And within contract, I try to put as many provisions that favor transparency and relationship. I could
Yes. And this
give a
is
lecture like on this,
is a fascinating area because there's a lot of research on how does it work with written contracts and trust, for example. Because as soon as you ask somebody to sign a written contract, in a way, you're showing that you don't really trust them 100%. Because if you trusted them, you wouldn't need a written contract.
No, you need a written contract because people are not immortal. So if
Yes,
you believe that you will never die, that's fine. You don't need a contract. But but it's a bit foolish to think that you will never die. Therefore, you don't write it for us. You write it for the others.
yes, and you also define roles and responsibilities and things like this. But in the vast majority of relationships, the relationship part is more important than the contract itself.
Of course.
So yeah, and this is also very cultural specific. So certain cultures will rely more on contracts. Other cultures will rely more on oral or what we call relational contracts, where you just shake hands. You know, Latin America, it's a very relational based society. The Middle East, Southern Europe, for example, a lot of Asia is very relation based.
So then you change the look of the agreement. You don't call it an agreement, contract. You call it maybe a term sheet, a letter of intent. You know, you can have a report of our meeting.
Yes.
It can really take a different, and you change. Sometimes it's a Times Roman, sometimes it's Arial. You know, you play with the.
Yes.
It's an artistic work.
It is. It is. And also importantly, external factors. So if your country risk is very high, for example, political risk, or demand is very uncertain, again, that's a minus. So again, you're better off exporting. If the market size is very big and it's growing, that's a plus. You want to be present on the market. You want to be producing, and you don't want to be sharing it with anybody else. So that's hierarchical. Obviously, if you've got indirect and direct trade barriers, that's hierarchical, because if you've got trade barriers to set up to bring your oat milk into Brazil, then it makes so much more sense to produce in Brazil, and therefore you don't encounter the trade barriers. Raluca, you talked about intensity of competition. Yes, if that's very intense, that's a minus. Then you should be exporting because it's quite difficult to your estimated market share might be a lot lower than it actually is, and you have market risk. And again, if there's a small number of relevant export intermediaries, then again, you need to be hierarchical, because you can't rely on partners. So basically what you do is you go and have a look for your particular company, let's say Oatly, and you're thinking about a particular region like Latin America. You can actually go in and use this as a framework to decide, well, should we set up our own bottling plant in Brazil? Should we have a licensee in Brazil, an intermediate mode? Or should we simply produce in the US and export to Brazil, for example? So I had one or two other slides here, but I'm not going to have time, unfortunately, to go through those. But I agreed with Jean-Paul that if I didn't go through everything to do with entry modes, that he would talk about it a little bit as well, so that he would supplement me if we ran out of time. When we're looking at things like product complexity, you might wonder why that's a positive. Well, it's a positive because of the worries that if your product is very complex, you have to explain it to an agent, for example. And if you have to explain it in big detail in very technical terms to an agent, you can risk that agent then starts to build something that looks like yours or tries to copy yours in some respect. So if that is the case, and it's a very complex product, then it's better to choose a more hierarchical mode. So if we did this for Oatly in Brazil, if we actually did this exercise and we had some internal insight into what levels of control and flexibility and risk aversion Oatly had, then this would give us an idea of what type of mode we should use to go into Brazil, for example. Any questions about anything that we've talked about today?
Just a little observation, because I think indeed choosing an entry mode is very, I mean, it's a very difficult decision, which has, first of all, huge financial consequences, and also it clearly impacts the level of control over the operations in the country. Maybe in some of the cases, not always, because depending on the barriers in place, this could not be, sometimes it's not possible. I'm thinking about China a few years ago, where companies had to go for a joint venture in order to sell in China. Now it's not anymore the case. But in case, let's say, no such barriers exist, maybe a gradual approach towards entry modes would be a quite coherent one, in the sense that, for instance, you use intermediaries, and then you see how the product fares in the country. And then if you realize there is the potential is really good and the product gets well known, furthermore, you are thinking about more engaging entry modes.
I'm really happy you brought this up, Raluca, because it is so important not to just look at this as fixed or written in stone. That this strategy needs to be adjusted according to everything that is happening. So the idea here is that we've got many companies, let's say Oatly, that produce oat milk, but will have different entry modes for different countries. So we have what's called a portfolio approach, so that they would have licensing in Brazil, they would have their own bottling in China, they would have exporting in Belgium, whatever. So you choose different entry modes for different countries. That's one thing. But the second thing which you mentioned, which is really important, is that you need to change your entry mode strategy as these factors change. So it could be that suddenly there are no trade barriers. Yeah, now suddenly the country is in the WTO, it's abiding by that, there's no trade wars or anything. So that would all of a sudden mean that you don't necessarily need to produce in Brazil. You could export to Brazil instead, for example. So companies are always thinking, how do these factors change? And these factors are changing on a daily basis. Yeah. So new competitors could be coming into the business. Some could be going bankrupt. Same with intermediaries. The market size could be growing rapidly. Country risk could suddenly increase tremendously. And it was rather interesting that you talked about China. Yes, companies were forced to do joint ventures to operate in China. And this was a masterful strategy by the Chinese, because with a joint venture, you have to share all your knowledge and information with your joint venture partner, which is a local Chinese partner. So all of a sudden, they know all about your knowledge, your technology, how you make products, and so on. And you don't need to go through this learning process that other firms have to go through. It's basically handed to you. So this is why China has been able to have such high levels of innovation and technology so quickly. But of course, when China joined the WTO, they were not allowed to insist upon joint ventures. There are certain exemptions in the car industry, in energy, and one or two other sensitive areas they still have a right to ask for joint ventures. But you're quite right, in all other instances, they don't. If you're an insurance company, you can go in with your own sales subsidiary now, and you weren't allowed to do that earlier. But we're also seeing China was super. I first went to China in 87, and there, this was before everybody started thinking China was a great idea. And then all of a sudden, in the 90s and the 2000s, everybody is in China. It's more a question of why you are not in China. And now, of course, we've seen various things happening. This could be political freedoms. It could be the lockdown in the pandemic. That now many companies are thinking about exiting China, or at least having what they call China Plus strategy. So in other words, you have something in China, but you have the rest in Thailand or Vietnam or wherever. And this is the way many companies are going. We're seeing certain companies like Apple now pulling out of China, what they call de-risking. And this is incredible. This would have been unheard of 10 years ago. So yes, countries change, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. And this means that you need to have a very open, very flexible mindset towards your entry modes and think about changing them from time to time as the situation changes. Have you enjoyed it? Our little 3 hours together.
Yes, it was really very interesting. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're most welcome.
Thanks a
You're
lot.
most welcome.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind words. Well, it's been a pleasure. So thank you very much. I think I'm linked in with all of you. So we're able to keep in touch. You're always welcome to reach out. Otherwise, a very warm welcome to the Institute MX certified expert group. And yeah, I hope that we can that our paths will cross again at some point in the future. But enjoy the rest of your program and enjoy your time with Jean-Paul tonight. And yeah, thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot and keep in touch.
Yes, thank you very much. Jean-Paul, are you there?